Tonight on Nation to Nation, exploring the hidden history of Indigenous relations with Ukrainian settlers, how one researcher is uncovering the connections that were often forgotten and sometimes erased.
And over the generations, it got easier and easier to bend the truth that when indeed they did arrive, when our ancestors arrived, that the lands were empty.
And tax talk.
The speech that caused so much hurt and distress was actually a speech about taxes.
How it's often used to promote anti-Indigenous politics, according to sociologist Kyle Willman.
And, it's a form of what I would call fiscalized racism, right? So how it is that people see and articulate racism through these seemingly neutral and objective kind of fiscal concerns.
Plus, pandemic restrictions are being lifted across the country. What should First Nations expect as their neighbors loosen up?
If your neighboring jurisdiction or your health authority or your province is opening up measures, it doesn't mean you as a First Nation have to.
I'm Brett Forster, and welcome to Nation. Ukrainian settlers came to the prairies in the late 19th century, and Leah Herzoon has been wrestling with a mystery for much of her academic career. Herzoon's Ukrainian grandmother used to always tell her there were no native people in the part of Alberta where she grew up, but she wondered why there were stories of Indigenous families who had grandfathers knowing some Ukrainian and their grandmothers passing down poppy seed cake recipes. To answer it, Herzoon is currently a PhD student at the University of Alberta, and she joins me now. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So what have you learned about the relationship between Ukrainian settlers and First Nations?
I think I've learned so many things, but one of the biggest things that I've learned, or one of the most surprising things that I've learned, to me at least, is that from a First Nations or Métis perspective, a lot of them have a lot of Ukrainian kin, but from a Ukrainian Canadian or Ukrainian settler perspective, a lot of them are very unaware that that there's any connection between Ukrainian settlers and Indigenous peoples here in East Central Alberta. That's the thing that I think that I've been most surprised to learn, and my research right now is trying to tease out why there is such a different perspective on those relationships between the communities.
Can you give us a little bit of an anecdote? What is something specific you heard about how Indigenous people and Ukrainian settlers interacted at one time?
Absolutely. So there's a plethora of stories from the early days of Ukrainian settlers arriving here on the prairies, but specifically in East Central Alberta, where my research focuses. And there's a lot of stories about Indigenous folks reaching out to Ukrainian settlers to help them through their first winters, to guide them through the new lands. And then there's a lot of stories of interactions too as time goes on. But as time goes on, a lot of the Ukrainian stories that we have tend to have Indigenous folks sort of being on the periphery, that they sort of become this ephemeral being, and then later in time, a lot of Ukrainian settlers have stories about how their families employed Indigenous people to work on their farms, to pick rocks, and things like that. And so those are a lot of the stories that the Ukrainian settlers tell. But on the other hand, I've also heard really heartbreaking stories of First Nations and Métis people who were shunned by their Ukrainian families, that their father perhaps married a First Nations woman or a Métis woman, and that their Baba, their Ukrainian grandmother, really didn't have a lot to do with them. And so as a result, they're really disconnected from their Ukrainian heritage and from their Ukrainian kin. And so the research that I'm doing is bringing out a myriad of different types of stories.
So it wasn't always cordial. Were there some tensions, given that Ukrainian settlers were just that, settlers on Indigenous land?
Absolutely, absolutely. So one of the things that we need to think about, and that I think is probably a fairly well-known concept, is that when Ukrainians first arrived in Canada, they were really discriminated against. They had a hard time. They were really othered by the predominant Anglo-Saxon community. And so they really struggled to find their place in the Canadian project. And so in the early days, um, they they really sympathized with Indigenous folks because they shared a lot of the same struggles. But as time went on, and as Ukrainians came to be known as part of white settler Canada, and especially in the late 60s and 70s, when multiculturalism was very prominent on the national stage here in what is Canada, Ukrainians really found their place in the project of Canada. And so it was around that time that they really started to adopt the same mindset of the rest of settler Canada. And they were part of that large group now of white settlers. And so they often then reverted to othering Indigenous peoples, just as mainstream Canada had done.
Well, right now, Indigenous people have shown a lot of support for Ukraine during the ongoing invasion by wearing kokum scarves and posting pictures online. What do you think is driving that solidarity?
Absolutely. I know that it's been wonderful to see this great show of solidarity. And I think that for a lot of folks, they recognize that even though they may not be close to their kinship connections that are Ukrainian, that they want to demonstrate, or they want to show that regardless of that disconnection, there is still that connection. Folks are still kin. And also, I think there's a more general human connection. These humans are in need. They're having their lands invaded by a foreign power. And I think that's all too familiar for many Indigenous communities across Canada and in other places in the world. And so I think that show of solidarity really speaks to those human connections, to that willingness to support kin in their time of need.
All right, I'd like to ask you one final question about your research. You know, you said you pointed to some of that erasure a little bit earlier. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What led to your grandmother saying that there were no Native people?
For a lot of Ukrainian settlers and many settlers across the prairies specifically, it was necessary for them to think that these lands were empty, to think that they were the first people on these lands, because otherwise you have to start considering that you are displacing people, and that concept, I think, for a lot of people is a very tough one to grapple with. And so to alleviate that grappling that folks had to do, they created these myths and sort of bent the truth. And over the generations, it got easier and easier to bend the truth that when indeed they did arrive, when our ancestors arrived, that the lands were empty, that they were the first sort of true occupants of this land, that they worked this land, they farmed this land, and that's what really made it to be part of Canada. And so I think that those stories helped to reinforce the place of Ukrainians in Canada, and unfortunately, in that process, they erased the Indigenous histories of the lands that they called home.
All right, Ms. Herzoon, I want to thank you for your insight.
Thank you very much for having me.
Coming up after a short break, I'll speak with an academic who studies the relationship between concerns about taxation and anti-Indigenous politics. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Recent academic research investigates the links between tax talk, racism, and Canadian colonialism. Sociologist Kyle Wilmot argues anti-Indigenous politics often come disguised as harmless fiscal concerns. For example, he cites former Senator Lynn Bayak, who tied her defense of residential schools into a 2017 speech calling for a national audit of Indigenous spending.
The speech that caused so much hurt and distress was actually a speech about taxes. That's my mission here in the Senate, is the wise use of tax dollars.
So there's probably no single answer to this question, but where do these ideas, myths, and tropes come from?
Right. I think that one of the first places that it comes from is this idea that First Nations people don't pay taxes, right? So they rely on that myth that the Section 87 of the Indian Act that has a tax exemption is very wide, but in fact, it's obviously very narrow. And given that, 56% of First Nations people as of 2016 live off reserve, and many more people who live on reserve work off of reserve, meaning that they're going to be paying income taxes and other taxes, right? So, it's just an incorrect point. It's a myth, right? And I do think that ultimately a lot of it flows from that point, and as well from the subtext of this white possessive colonial narrative that exists around taxes, right? So the subtext of a lot of this taxpayer identity stuff really is basically, I support you with my taxes, and you must do what I say because what I say matters more than you. That idea that if you pay tax, you're more legitimate than others, and that taxpayers should get to exercise sovereignty over Indigenous nations, right?
Well, on that note, in 2021, you co-authored a study of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and its attitudes toward First Nations. What did this reveal?
Well, it revealed a lot, and it's some research that has been discussed by a lot of Native people for a long time, right? Pam Palmater, for example, has been talking about the CTF for many years. But in the research that I did, we looked at basically every document that the CTF published over about 20 years. And we found that they were really intent on, for example, abolishing the Indian Act and not replacing it, which would basically mean total assimilation and legal elimination of First Nations. They were very much pushing private property on reserves. They really in many ways denied Indigenous nationhood. So they would often call the Section 87 tax exemptions race-based tax law, right? So they want people to be mad, right? And that's what the archive of documents that I showed. They wanted people to be mad. They wanted people to think about Native people through this kind of taxpayer lens. So they put that information out there. They frame it in this kind of your hard-earned taxpayer dollars are being wasted on or by Native people, and then they relied on those already existing cultural tropes that have been around for a really long time. And I think the research shows that they preyed on those pre-existing stereotypes and myths, and also tried to entrench and deepen them, right?
They're not gone either, right? These stereotypes and myths are still here. And if you're First Nations, you've probably faced them before in your life. So now that we know what they are and how they operate, how do we begin to counter these ideas?
Yeah. Well, it's a big question of what should be done, but I think people really need to educate themselves about these kinds of things. But I think there's also a responsibility that lies with journalists when they consult the CTF, for example, right? The CTF is very consistently consulted by the press to comment, and they get kind of presented as this disinterested group, this kind of, because they've got that folksy taxpayer identity that's attached to them, so that they're the representative of the regular person. Well, journalists need to stop consulting these people because they're very deeply ideological. And the work that I've done, the work that Pam Palmater's done, the work that other people like David Kleiman-Haga have done showed that they are very secretive about how it is that they operate as an organization, where their funding comes from, and how strongly lined up they are with corporate interests, in addition to their anti-Indigenous political ideology. So I think that journalists really need to pay attention to that.
Yes, I wanted to switch gears a little bit on that note. The Conservative Party line over the last couple of years has been that First Nations should develop their own economies and rely less on federal cash. Where does that policy fit in with your analysis?
Yeah, I think it really stems from, in many ways, from this idea, right, that First Nations are taking up too much money, right? That First Nations are dependent, and it flows from this taxpayer idea, I think, and so you see that in a lot of the conservative politicians who are who've been running over the last several years, including Pierre Poilievre, who's currently running. And you see these kinds of ideas that are getting pushed out there. And he was somebody that was many years ago saying that there was too much money being spent on First Nations, and he was really concerned about the cost of residential school settlements, right? So I think it really flows from this stuff very clearly.
Well, on the other hand, the Liberals have invested in Indigenous communities at unprecedented, but some might also say unsustainable levels. What does reconciliation look like in the area of fiscal policy?
Well, one of the things that I think the federal government obviously needs to start doing is thinking about, and this is one of the reasons that people often think about Indigenous people in relation to tax, is they don't think about Indigenous nations as nations, right? This is why the CTF would call it race-based tax law. They're not thinking about Indigenous nations as nations. So I think it depends on what on the First Nation, on the Indigenous nation, but it needs to start with respecting the sort of nation-to-nation relationship.
Well, Professor Wilmot, there's much more to discuss, but unfortunately we are out of time for this segment. I want to thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks so much, Brett.
After a short break, Dr. Evan Adams is here with an update on COVID-19 in Indigenous communities as provinces across Canada begin to lift restrictions. Welcome back. Provinces and territories are beginning to lift pandemic-related health measures this month. Many are set to abolish the vaccine pass along with mask mandates. After nearly 2 years of COVID-19, the prospect of returning to normal may seem exciting, but perhaps a little nerve-wracking. Dr. Evan Adams is the Deputy Chief Medical Officer at Indigenous Services Canada. He joins me to discuss the big lift. Welcome to the show.
Hi there, how are you?
I'm well. Dr. Adams, what advice is your department offering communities as neighboring jurisdictions loosen up?
Well, there are probably a number of reasons why some jurisdictions are lifting public health measures. Some of them are not related or not directly related to health. They may be related to, say, to economic recovery or, just allowing people to be to leave home and go back to work or school. But we're definitely supportive of self-determination in communities. Communities can decide. They may want to weigh factors like how much COVID is right nearby. I know some people have been using the terms mild disease, but there can be long-term sequelae, especially for those with most risk, like older people, babies, those with chronic diseases, and we should probably get used to some disagreement amongst ourselves, like within families, within communities. Some communities are eager to open for business. Others are saying we're not ready to open. We don't feel safe yet, and that may be true for workers. That may be true for students. Some eager to go back. Some saying I would like to wait a little bit before we open things up. So it is going to be a bit of a mixed bag out there. I do expect that there will be some conflict or tension between people, and I think some people will be unhappy or outraged about how things are going.
Well, you mentioned the possibility of other motives aside from health for lifting restrictions. So what is your message to people who may be feeling anxious about losing the mask or ending physical distancing?
I would say that it is well within your right to express your uncomfortableness with how things are going. So, for instance, we are telling employers that it is possible that some of your workers may not want to return. We're telling schools it's possible some of your students will say that they wish to keep masks on or to continue social distancing and some of the other public health measures that they've gotten used to. So we should be ready. We should be ready for that. And from a health point of view, if we were just looking solely at health, the safest thing would be, to not encounter anyone. So we do know that that's not always possible. So we should all expect to be somewhat uncomfortable, I think, at some point.
What do you think the future looks like going forward? Is COVID something we eventually learn to live with from now on, just like the seasonal flu?
I think our journey with COVID still has a ways to go. So, for instance, we are looking ahead towards perhaps another variant of concern. I think we're still learning how to adjust to the new reality. I think there is some healing that can happen now, in that some people are quite frustrated and tired. I think mental health has suffered. I think some people are actually having setbacks that are, economic or related to their academic achievement or related to their workplace. So I like to think that we as Indigenous people know all about healing. That even though we're tired and perhaps frustrated, we do know that we can get better. So I do see this as a time for healing and feeling better about what's happened.
What are some ways Indigenous communities can prepare right now for future waves or variants that may be coming, as you just indicated?
Because of sheer numbers of persons with Omicron, perhaps you are more likely to have mild disease, but you're also more likely to have complications. So we're still recommending to people to be vaccinated. And we also are recommending self-determination, self-determination being the right of a nation to determine its own course without interference from other nations. So if your neighboring jurisdiction or your health authority or your province is opening up measures, it doesn't mean you as a First Nation have to. And also the rights of individuals, the right of the individual to self-determine. You can't be forced to go into situations that are uncomfortable for you.
Well, the right of self-determination has been a big topic here in Ottawa with the protests. Do you think voluntary vaccination will be the new normal, or could we see the return of mandates if things do get tough with COVID again?
Well, we do know that the vast majority of people believe in vaccination and believe in the realities of COVID. And I personally don't see wearing a mask as an issue of freedom so much as safety. So I wouldn't conflate the two. But again, I do want to reiterate that we will always have vaccinated and unvaccinated amongst us. And those who are nervous about COVID and those who minimize COVID mixed together. So I personally have seen the divisions between us as being really quite damaging to us personally, to our mental health, and to our families and societies. So I do think we should learn to be kind to each other and not have schisms between us.
Well, I think that's a good place to leave it. Dr. Adams, I appreciate your time. Thanks for being here.
No problem. Thanks.
And that's all we have for you tonight on Nation to Nation. Remember to find us on social media or online at aptnnews.ca/Nation to Nation. I'm Brett Forrester, and thanks for watching.